There are neighborhoods where nothing ever seems to happen, the kind of places where mornings begin slowly and quietly, where the streets are clean, the lawns are trimmed, and the loudest sound you'll usually hear is the distant hum of someone starting their car for work. Daniel Carter lived in a neighborhood exactly like that, a quiet suburb outside Portland, Oregon. Rows of modest houses sat along a gentle curve of road. Maple trees lined the sidewalks, their branches forming a soft canopy over the street. In the early mornings, sunlight filtered through the leaves in thin golden strips. Most days, if you stepped outside around 7 o'clock, you would hear three simple things: birds waking up, a garage door opening somewhere down the block, and the faint bark of a dog that probably belonged to someone walking it before work. Nothing dramatic, nothing unexpected, and that was exactly why Daniel moved there. For years, he had lived in a busy apartment building in Seattle. Noise had been constant there. Music through thin walls, people arguing in hallways, sirens in the distance nearly every night. Eventually, he had decided he'd had enough. He wanted silence, or at least something close to it. So he bought a small house in Oregon. It wasn't fancy, but it was peaceful, and peace, Daniel believed, was worth more than anything, especially when you worked from home. Daniel was a software developer. His office was a spare bedroom at the front of the house, where a wide desk faced a large window that looked out onto the street. From that window, he could see nearly everything that happened on the block, which, most of the time, wasn't much. And Daniel liked it that way. His routine rarely changed. Wake up, make coffee, sit at his desk, write code, take a short walk in the afternoon, then back to work. Most days, he didn't leave the house until evening, which meant most of the things he bought arrived the same way. By delivery, boxes from Amazon, occasionally a tool he ordered online, sometimes groceries. Every week or so, a delivery truck would pull up in front of his house. A driver would walk up the path, leave a box on the porch, and drive away. It was simple, efficient, predictable. At least, it used to be. Because about a month earlier, something strange began happening. The first time it happened, Daniel barely noticed. He received a notification on his phone. "Your package has been delivered." He opened the door a few minutes later. Nothing. He assumed the driver had left it at the wrong house. It happened sometimes. So Daniel shrugged and went back to work. But 2 days later, it happened again. Another notification. Another empty porch. That's when Daniel began to feel a small, uncomfortable thought forming in the back of his mind. 3 days later, it happened again. Then again, and then one more time. 5 packages. Gone. No broken locks. No damaged boxes. No noise. Just gone. At first, Daniel wondered if someone in the neighborhood had taken them by mistake. But nobody came to return anything. Nobody knocked on his door. And none of the packages ever appeared. Which meant one thing. Someone had taken them. And whoever it was careful. Daniel checked the street. There were no security cameras pointing at his porch. Not from his house. Not from his neighbors. If someone had taken those boxes, they had done it without leaving any proof behind. But there was one detail Daniel couldn't stop thinking about. Every time a delivery truck arrived, someone was watching. Across the street from Daniel's house stood another home, older than most on the block. Its paint slightly faded, its porch shaded by a tall cedar tree, and almost every morning, sitting in a wooden chair on that porch, was an elderly man, Walter Harris. Daniel didn't know him well. In fact, They had barely spoken. Sometimes they nodded politely when passing each other on the sidewalk, but that was about it. Mr. Harris lived alone. He had for years. The neighbors said his wife had passed away a long time ago. Since then, he spent most of his days sitting outside, watching the street, watching the neighborhood, watching the quiet life of the suburb move slowly past him. Daniel had never thought much about it before, but after the third missing package, the thought began to creep into his mind. Was it possible that Mr. Harris knew something? Daniel tried to dismiss the idea. The man was nearly 80, thin, slow-moving, hardly the image of someone stealing boxes off porches. But the thought stayed there, quiet, persistent, because every time the delivery truck arrived, Mr. Harris was there, sitting in that chair, watching, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that somehow the old man knew more than he was saying. By the time the fifth package disappeared, Daniel's patience was gone. He sat at his desk that evening, staring at the delivery notifications on his computer screen. 5 items delivered. 5 items missing. The silence of the house suddenly felt less peaceful than before. It felt unfair. Daniel leaned back in his chair, and after a long moment, he sighed. "All right," he murmured to the empty room. "If someone's taking them, let's see what happens next time." That night, Daniel prepared something unusual. He took an empty shipping box from his garage, carefully sealed it with tape, printed a shipping label, made it look exactly like any other delivery package. But inside the box, there wasn't a product. There wasn't anything valuable at all. There was only a small device Daniel had ordered online weeks earlier. A harmless but extremely unpleasant prank item. A pressurized stink spray, the kind designed to release the moment the box was opened. He placed the device carefully inside, closed the lid, and set the box on his front porch the next morning. Then he went inside, back to his desk, back to work. From the window, he could see the box sitting there, perfectly ordinary, perfectly tempting. The morning passed quietly, just like every other morning in the neighborhood. Birds, a car passing by, leaves moving in the breeze. Nothing unusual, until sometime after noon. Daniel paused while typing. Something was wrong. He sniffed the air, once, then again. A smell was creeping into the room, faint at first, but unmistakable, and it was getting stronger. Daniel stood slowly from his chair, walked to the window, and looked outside. Across the street, the windows of Mr. Harris's house were wide open. The old man stood on his porch, waving a towel through the air as if trying to push something away, and the smell was drifting directly from his house. Daniel stared for several seconds, then leaned back slightly from the window, his heart beating just a little faster, because in that moment, a single thought settled firmly in his mind. Maybe, just maybe, he had finally discovered who had been taking his packages, and Daniel had no idea that by the next morning, the entire neighborhood would wake up to a sound it had never heard before. A trumpet, blasting through the quiet suburban air, exactly at 7:00 a.m. The next morning began the same way every morning in that neighborhood did. Quiet, still, soft light slipping between the maple leaves that lined the street. Daniel woke just before 7. He always did. Years of working on tight project deadlines had trained his body to wake early, even when he didn't need to. He made coffee, black, strong, then carried the mug down the hallway toward his office. Outside, the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always had. A woman walked her golden retriever down the sidewalk. A man 2 houses over backed his pickup truck slowly out of the driveway. A sprinkler ticked rhythmically somewhere down the street. Daniel sat at his desk and opened his laptop. For a moment, everything felt normal again, almost as if the strange events of the past few weeks had simply faded away. But then, a sound shattered the quiet. A trumpet. Loud, sharp, unexpected. Daniel nearly spilled his coffee. The first note cut through the morning air like a car horn echoing down a hallway. Then another note. And another. Not music exactly. More like someone warming up. Testing breath. Testing sound. Daniel froze. The trumpet continued, blasting uneven notes across the calm suburban street. Daniel pushed his chair back and walked quickly to the window. Across the street, Walter Harris stood on his front porch. The old man held a trumpet in both hands. Not casually, not like someone playing for fun, but with the calm posture of someone who had done it for many years. He lifted the instrument again. Another loud note echoed across the neighborhood. Then a short scale. Then a long breath through the brass bell of the instrument. Daniel blinked in confusion. Of all the things he expected after yesterday's smell incident, this had not been one of them. Another trumpet note rang out. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A bedroom window opened 2 houses away. Someone looked outside. Daniel checked the time on his computer screen. 2:00 a.m. Exactly. The trumpet played again. This time longer. A slow, rising tone that stretched across the street and seemed to bounce off the quiet houses around them. Daniel leaned against the window frame, watching, trying to understand what was happening. Was this intentional? The thought made his stomach tighten. Yesterday, Daniel had set a trap. He had expected a reaction. But this felt different. The old man lowered the trumpet and wiped the mouthpiece with a cloth. Then he lifted it again. Another loud note. And another. Daniel rubbed his forehead. If this was meant to be retaliation, it was strangely precise. Because in Oregon, the local noise ordinance allowed loud sounds starting at 7 in the morning. Before that, neighbors could complain. After that, technically, it was legal. Daniel sat back in his chair slowly. The trumpet continued outside. Loud, confident, persistent. He couldn't help wondering something. Was this coincidence, or was the old man sending a message? Walter Harris had lived in that house for nearly 40 years. Long before Daniel arrived. Long before most of the younger families moved into the neighborhood. In fact, Walter had watched the streets slowly transform over the decades. He remembered when the houses were first built. He remembered when the maple trees were barely taller than the streetlights. And he remembered the day he and his wife, Eleanor, moved into the house across from Daniel's. That had been a long time ago, back when Walter was still serving in the military, back when he wore a uniform most days of the year, back when the trumpet had been more than just an instrument. It had been part of his life, part of his duty. Walter had played trumpet in the United States Army Band. For years, his mornings had begun exactly the same way. Breath, sound, discipline. Music that marked ceremonies. Music that honored service. Music that filled large halls and open fields with something bigger than words. But those days were long behind him. After he retired from the army, Walter had kept the trumpet stored away. Sometimes months passed without him touching it. After Eleanor passed away, sometimes years did. Yet that morning, for the first time in a long while, the trumpet had returned to his hands. Walter lowered the instrument and looked across the street. Daniel's window. The curtain shifted slightly. Walter noticed. Of course he noticed. Old age had slowed many things, but observation wasn't one of them. He knew exactly when the young man across the street was watching. Walter lifted the trumpet again. Another clear note rang through the morning air. Daniel tried to focus on his work. But the trumpet made that difficult. Every few seconds, another note arrived. Sometimes long, sometimes short, sometimes sharp enough to make him flinch slightly. Daniel checked the time again. Zählen ba. Then, 7-1. Then, 7-1-6. The trumpet kept going. Finally, around 7:20, the sound stopped. The neighborhood fell quiet again. Just like that, as if nothing had happened. Daniel leaned back in his chair. The silence almost felt heavier now. He glanced across the street again. Walter Harris had already placed the trumpet back inside the house. The porch was empty. The street returned to its peaceful rhythm. But Daniel couldn't shake a strange feeling. The trumpet had not sounded random. It had sounded deliberate, measured, like someone who knew exactly when to begin and exactly when to stop. Later that evening, Daniel stepped outside to take out the trash. The sun had nearly set. Soft orange light stretched across the quiet street. He rolled the trash bin toward the curb, then froze. A new object stood mounted above the garage of Walter Harris's house. A motion sensor floodlight, large, bright, and pointed directly toward Daniel's property. Daniel stared at it for several seconds. He knew exactly what that kind of light did. If someone stepped into the driveway, the light would trigger instantly. Blinding, powerful. Daniel slowly walked back toward his front door. And just as he stepped into the yard, the light exploded on. White. Intense. So bright he had to squint. The beam poured straight through his front window, straight toward his bedroom. Daniel looked up at the light. Then, across the street, Walter Harris stood on his porch again, arms folded, calm, watching. The two men looked at each other across the quiet street. No words, no gestures, just a long, silent moment between them. Daniel went back inside, closed the door, and stood there in the dark living room for a while. Because for the first time since moving to the quiet suburb, the neighborhood no longer felt peaceful. It felt like something had begun. Something small, something quiet, but something that was slowly turning into a conflict neither man had planned. And Daniel didn't yet realize that before the week was over, the trumpet would become the most talked about sound on the entire street. That night, Daniel did not sleep well, not because of noise. Ironically, the street was quieter than ever. No trumpet, no voices, no cars passing late, just silence. But every time Daniel drifted toward sleep, a sudden burst of white light would fill his room. The motion sensor. Each time a car passed, each time a neighbor walked their dog, each time a branch moved in the wind, the floodlight switched on, bright enough to push through the blinds, bright enough to wake him again and again. By 2 a.m, Daniel was staring at the ceiling, his eyes open, his mind replaying the last 24 hours over and over. The smell, the trumpet, the light, none of it felt accidental anymore. Daniel turned his head toward the window. Even through the blinds, he could see the glow of the floodlight across the street. Walter Harris's house sat in complete darkness, except for that one powerful beam. Daniel seahilled, then turned onto his side. But sleep never really came. Morning arrived slowly. A pale gray light spread across the sky as the sun began rising behind the trees. Daniel sat at his desk with a fresh cup of coffee. He looked tired, his shoulders slightly tense, his eyes drifting again and again toward the window. The clock on his screen read 6:58 a.m. He waited. The neighborhood outside was quiet. Birds chirped in the trees. A car passed slowly down the road. Then the clock changed. 7:00 a.m., and right on time, the trumpet sounded again, the same sharp blast from the day before. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Another note followed. Then another, a rising scale that echoed through the morning air. He walked to the window. Walter Harris stood on his porch again, trumpet in hand. Calm, focused. Daniel leaned against the window frame, watching. Something about the old man's posture caught his attention. This wasn't random noise. The way Walter stood, the way he held the instrument, the way he controlled his breath, Daniel could tell immediately. This man had played before. For many years, the trumpet sang out again, a slow, clean tone that lingered across the street. For a moment, Daniel almost forgot he was annoyed, because the sound wasn't terrible. It was strong, confident, practiced. But that didn't change one fact. It was loud, very loud, and it was happening right outside his window. Every morning, Daniel checked the time again. Qiling Wu, Qi Yiling, Qi Qi. Finally, the trumpet stopped, just like the day before. Walter wiped the mouthpiece with a small cloth and went back inside. Daniel stood quietly for a moment, then returned to his desk. But he wasn't thinking about work anymore. He was thinking about the old promise he had made to himself years earlier. A promise he had tried very hard to keep, several years before moving to Oregon. Daniel had lived in a tall apartment building in Seattle. At first, it seemed like a great place. Modern, convenient, close to downtown. But the walls were thin. Too thin. His neighbor next door loved loud music, especially late at night. At first, Daniel tried to ignore it. Headphones helped. White noise helped. But eventually, it became impossible. The music got louder. Arguments followed. Doors slamming. Voices through the walls. Then came the complaints. First, polite notes. Then angry knocks. Then shouting in the hallway. One night, the argument escalated so badly the police had to come. Daniel still remembered standing in the hallway that night. Neighbors watching. Voices raised. Embarrassment hanging in the air like smoke. It was the kind of situation that makes a home stop feeling like a home. A place that should feel safe suddenly felt tense, uncomfortable, hostile. After that night, Daniel made a decision. He moved out, and when he finally found the small, quiet house in Oregon, he promised himself something. A simple rule, one he repeated every time he thought about the past. No more neighbor problems. No confrontations. No arguments. No drama. Just quiet. Just peace. For years, he kept that promise. Until the packages disappeared. Until the smell trap exploded. Until the trumpet started playing at 7 every morning. Daniel leaned back in his chair. His computer screen glowed softly in front of him. But his mind was somewhere else. He opened his delivery history again. 5 missing packages. Each one marked delivered. Each one never seen again. His jaw tightened slightly. Because the deeper truth wasn't about money. The items themselves weren't that expensive. It was something else. Something harder to explain. The feeling that someone believed they could take from him. And he wouldn't do anything about it. Daniel rubbed his temples slowly, then whispered quietly to himself. Someone thinks they're clever. He stared out the window toward Walter Harris's house. The porch was empty now, but the memory of that trumpet still lingered in the air. And for the first time since moving into the quiet neighborhood, Daniel realized something. The peace he had come here for might already be gone, and the strange conflict growing between him and the old man across the street was far from over. Because later that same evening, Daniel would step outside again and discover that the floodlight across the street had been adjusted. Now it didn't just shine toward his driveway. It pointed directly into his bedroom window. And that would be the moment Daniel finally understood something important. If this was a game, Walter Harris had just made the next move. By the third night, Daniel understood something very clearly. The light was not an accident. It turned on every time he stepped outside, every time a shadow moved across his yard, every time a car passed slowly down the street. But what bothered Daniel the most was the direction of the beam. It didn't just light the driveway. It pointed straight toward his bedroom window. Around midnight, the room flashed bright again. Daniel sat up in bed. The light poured through the blinds in long white stripes across the wall. He rubbed his face slowly. For a moment, he thought about walking across the street, knocking on Walter Harris's door, simply asking the question, "Did you take my packages?" But then another memory surfaced. The hallway in Seattle, neighbors staring, voices raised, police lights flashing through apartment windows. Daniel let out a long breath and lay back down. No, he whispered to himself. Not again. He wasn't going to start a confrontation. Not like before. But that didn't mean he had to sit quietly either. The next morning came slowly. The clock on Daniel's desk read 6:55 a.m. He was already awake. Coffee sat untouched beside his keyboard. Outside, the street was still calm. A thin mist hovered above the lawns. A woman jogged past with headphones in her ears. Daniel watched the clock carefully. Liu Wu Ba. Liu Wu Jiu. Then 7:00 a.m. Right on time. The trumpet exploded into the morning air again. Daniel closed his eyes for a second. Another note followed. Then another. But this time, Daniel didn't just listen. He stood up, walked to the closet, and reached inside. From the back corner, he pulled out a long black case covered in dust. He placed it on the desk. For several seconds, he simply stared at it. Then he opened it. Inside lay an old trumpet. Daniel hadn't touched it in nearly 10 years. Back in college, he had played casually in a small campus band. Nothing serious. Just a hobby. Something to do on weekends. After graduation, the instrument had slowly faded out of his life. Work replaced music. Deadlines replaced practice. Until eventually the trumpet became just another object packed away in a closet. Daniel picked it up. The brass surface had dulled slightly with time. He turned it in his hands, then looked out the window. Across the street, Walter Harris stood on his porch again, playing with steady breath, precise posture. Daniel lifted his own trumpet slowly, placed the mouthpiece against his lips, and blew. The note that came out was terrible. Flat, weak, uncontrolled. Daniel lowered the instrument and winced slightly. Across the street, Walter Harris stopped playing. The old man lowered his trumpet slowly, then looked up, directly toward Daniel's window. For a moment, neither of them moved. Daniel raised the trumpet again. This time he blew harder. Another rough note blasted out of the bell. It echoed across the quiet neighborhood. A car slowed slightly as it passed the houses. A curtain moved in a nearby window. Walter Harris stared across the street for a few seconds. Then something unexpected happened. The old man lifted his trumpet again and answered. One long, clean note. Deep, controlled, confident. Daniel responded with another note of his own. Not nearly as good, but loud. Very loud. The strange musical conversation continued for nearly 5 minutes. 2 trumpets, 2 houses, 2 men standing on opposite sides of the street. Until finally Walter Harris lowered his instrument, turned, and went back inside. Daniel stood there breathing slowly, his trumpet still in his hands. He didn't know exactly what had just happened, but something inside him felt strangely, satisfied. For the first time in days, the frustration in his chest eased slightly. That afternoon, Daniel stepped outside to check the mail. The sky had turned a pale blue. Warm sunlight stretched across the lawns. A few houses down, a boy rode his bicycle slowly along the sidewalk. Daniel walked toward the mailbox and noticed something unusual. Two neighbors were standing near the corner of the street, talking quietly. As Daniel approached, one of them smiled awkwardly. "Morning, Daniel." "Morning," he replied. The man hesitated, then chuckled slightly. "So, trumpet practice." "Huh?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. The other neighbor laughed. "Yeah, we heard you both." Daniel glanced briefly across the street. Walter Harris's porch was empty. "Just a little music," Daniel said calmly. "Well," the first neighbor replied with a grin, "it's definitely more interesting than the usual quiet around here." Daniel nodded politely. But as he walked back toward his house, he realized something important. The neighborhood had noticed what started as a small private conflict was no longer invisible. People were watching, listening, and quietly wondering what was happening between the young programmer and the old man across the street. That evening, Daniel sat at his desk, reviewing security camera options online. Because the more he thought about it, the more one question kept returning. If Walter Harris wasn't taking the packages, then who was? Daniel leaned forward in his chair, scrolling through different camera models: motion detection, night vision, cloud recording. Eventually, he selected a small wireless camera. Discreet, easy to hide. He clicked order now. Delivery scheduled for the next day. Daniel sat back, watching the confirmation screen. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow we find out. Because if someone really had been stealing his deliveries, the truth was about to be caught on camera. And Daniel had no idea that when that camera finally recorded the truth, everything he believed about Walter Harris would change. The camera arrived the next afternoon. It was smaller than Daniel expected. A plain black square no bigger than a deck of cards. Lightweight, quiet, almost invisible. Exactly what he needed. Daniel turned it in his hand for a moment before opening the instructions. The idea of installing a camera on his own porch felt strange. This had never been the kind of neighborhood that needed surveillance. People here waved to each other, borrowed ladders, left Christmas decorations out too long. But now Daniel found himself crouched beside his front door with a screwdriver. He mounted the small camera beneath the porch light, where it could see the steps and the edge of the walkway. From that angle, it would capture anyone approaching the house, anyone picking up a package, anyone walking away with it. When he finished, Daniel stepped back and checked the live feed on his phone. The view was clear. Front steps, mailbox, part of the sidewalk. Perfect. Now all he needed was patience. The next morning, the trumpet sounded again at 7. Daniel almost expected it now. The sharp note cut through the quiet street exactly on schedule. But something was slightly different. Instead of feeling annoyed, Daniel listened. Across the street, Walter Harris played the same steady exercises as the days before. Slow scales, long tones, short bursts of notes. There was discipline in the way the old man played. Even now, even after so many years, Daniel lifted his own trumpet. He hesitated for a moment, then answered with a note of his own. It wasn't nearly as clean, but it was loud. And for several minutes, the strange morning duet returned. 2 trumpets, 2 houses, 2 men who still hadn't spoken more than a few words to each other. Eventually, the music faded again. Walter lowered his instrument. Daniel lowered his, and the neighborhood returned to quiet. The package arrived around 2 in the afternoon. Daniel received the notification on his phone while sitting at his desk. Delivery completed. He opened the camera app immediately. The live feed showed a brown box resting on the porch. The driver was already gone. Daniel did not move. He leaned forward in his chair and waited. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. A dog walker moved down the sidewalk. A car rolled slowly past the house. Leaves shifted in the breeze. The box remained untouched. Daniel checked the time. 2:17 p.m. Still nothing. For the first time in weeks, Daniel allowed himself a small feeling of hope. Maybe the thief had stopped. Maybe the stink box had scared them away. Maybe movement. Daniel's eyes locked onto the camera feed. A man appeared at the edge of the frame, not walking from the street, walking back toward the house. Daniel frowned. The man wore a dark delivery jacket, but Daniel recognized something strange immediately. It wasn't the same driver from earlier. This man moved quickly, glancing left, glancing right. Then he stepped onto the porch, reached down, picked up the package, and turned away. Daniel shot up from his chair, his heart pounding. The man disappeared out of the camera frame. Daniel ran to the window. But by the time he looked outside, the street was empty. The thief was gone. Daniel rushed back to his desk and replayed the recording. Again and again. Each time the same sequence appeared. The delivery, the empty porch. Then 20 minutes later, the man returning, taking the box, walking away quickly. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. He paused the video, zoomed in. The man's face came into focus. Mid-30s, short beard, familiar uniform, a delivery jacket. But something else caught Daniel's attention. A logo patch, not from the same company that delivered the package earlier. This was someone different, someone who had been watching, waiting, then returning. Daniel sat back slowly. A strange mix of emotions moved through him. Relief, anger, confusion. Because suddenly one thing was clear. Walter Harris had never appeared in the footage. Not once. Not even walking near the porch. Daniel stared at the screen. The truth had been right there the whole time. The thief wasn't his neighbor. It was someone else entirely. Someone who knew how deliveries worked. Someone who waited until drivers left. Someone who came back quietly and stole the boxes before anyone noticed. Daniel rubbed his face slowly. A long breath escaped his chest. For several minutes, he said nothing, because the realization settling in his mind was uncomfortable. If Walter Harris wasn't the one taking the packages, then everything that had happened over the past week suddenly looked very different. The stink trap, the floodlight, the trumpet. Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked across the street through the window. Walter Harris sat on his porch again, just like always. Quiet. Still. Watching the neighborhood, Daniel watched him for a long time. Then his eyes drifted back to the paused video on the screen. Because there was still one piece of the puzzle missing. If the thief had dropped the stink box somewhere, how had it ended up inside Walter Harris's house? Daniel rewound the footage again. But the camera could only see the porch. It could not see the street. It could not see what happened after the thief left. And somewhere between those missing moments, the stink box had rolled into the old man's life. Daniel leaned forward slowly, a new thought forming in his mind. A possibility he hadn't considered before. Maybe Walter Harris had never taken anything. Maybe he had simply found the box, picked it up, opened it, and suffered the consequences of Daniel's trap. Daniel stared at the video one more time. And for the first time since this strange conflict began, he felt something he hadn't expected. Guilt. Because if that possibility was true, Then the old man across the street had spent the past week in a silent battle he never deserved. Daniel closed the laptop slowly and looked toward the window again. Walter Harris was still sitting on his porch, the same way he always had, watching the quiet street, holding a trumpet that had once meant something very different in his life. And Daniel began to wonder something he hadn't asked himself before. What kind of man had Walter Harris been before all of this started? Because sometimes the truth about a person doesn't appear all at once. Sometimes it reveals itself slowly, one note at a time, just like the sound of a trumpet echoing through a quiet neighborhood at 7 in the morning. That evening, Daniel sat in his kitchen long after the sun had disappeared behind the trees. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet he used to enjoy. But tonight, it felt different, heavy, because the video from the camera had changed everything. For weeks, Daniel had been certain about one thing. Walter Harris was the thief. The evidence had seemed obvious. The smell coming from the old man's house, the way he sat outside watching the street, the way he had looked toward Daniel's window after the stink box exploded. But now that certainty was gone, and in its place was something uncomfortable. Doubt. Daniel replayed the footage again on his phone. The delivery, the empty porch, then the second man returning. Quick, careful, stealing the package. Daniel paused the frame where the man's face was visible. There it was, clear, undeniable. The thief was someone else, which meant one thing Daniel hadn't expected. Walter Harris might have been innocent all along. Daniel leaned back in his chair and stared out the kitchen window. Across the street, the porch light in Walter's house had turned on. The old man sat in his usual chair, trumpet resting beside him. Watching the street, Daniel wondered how many evenings the man had spent exactly like that, quietly observing the world, without anyone really noticing him. The next morning, the trumpet sounded again at exactly 7. But this time, Daniel listened differently. Not with irritation, not with frustration, but with curiosity. The notes drifted through the air slowly, controlled, steady. There was a sadness in the sound Daniel hadn't noticed before. Or maybe it had always been there. He just hadn't been listening. Daniel lifted his own trumpet, but instead of answering loudly like before, he tried something different. He played the scale Walter had played the previous morning. Slowly, carefully, still imperfect, but better. Across the street, the music paused. For a moment, there was silence. Then Walter Harris spoke. His voice carried clearly across the quiet road. "You're holding the note too tight." Daniel blinked in surprise. It was the first real sentence Walter had spoken to him. Daniel lowered the trumpet slightly. "What do you mean?" Walter lifted his own trumpet again. "Breath first," he said calmly. "Sound comes after." Then he played a single note. Long, smooth, full. The sound seemed to hang in the air for a moment before fading away. Daniel tried again. This time he relaxed his breath. The note that came out was still rough, but stronger. Walter nodded once. Better. Then the old man went back inside without another word. Daniel stood in his yard, holding the trumpet. A strange feeling settled in his chest. The silent war between them had just shifted into something else. Something neither of them had expected. Later that afternoon, Daniel took a walk down the street. It was something he often did when he needed to think. The neighborhood was peaceful. Children rode bicycles near the corner. A dog barked behind a white fence. The same quiet rhythm of suburban life continued. As Daniel passed the house next door, Mrs. Patterson was watering her flowers. She smiled when she saw him. "Morning." "Daniel." "Morning." She turned off the hose and leaned on the fence. "I heard the music again today." Daniel laughed awkwardly. "Yeah, We've been practicing. She nodded toward Walter Harris's house. You know, he used to play professionally. Daniel stopped walking. Really? Oh yes, she said. Army band. Played at ceremonies all over the country. She wiped her hands on a towel. After he retired, he still played sometimes. Not as much these days, though. Daniel looked across the street. Walter's porch was empty now. Did he live alone long? Daniel asked. Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly. After Eleanor passed away, yes. Daniel hesitated. Eleanor, his wife, she said gently. Sweet woman. Everyone loved her. Mrs. Patterson glanced toward the house across the road. He hasn't been quite the same since she died. Daniel didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded, then continued walking. But the conversation stayed with him, because suddenly Walter Harris was no longer just the strange old man across the street. He was someone who had lived a long life, someone who had served, someone who had lost someone important, and maybe someone who had simply been sitting on his porch all these years, watching the world move on without him. That night, Daniel reviewed the security footage again. This time, he looked more carefully. The thief returned at the same time every day, always after the delivery, always moving quickly, always checking the street before stepping onto the porch. Then something else caught Daniel's attention. One of the recordings showed the thief leaving in a hurry. As the man turned away with the package, the box slipped from his hands. It fell onto the street. The thief cursed, but instead of picking it up, he grabbed the package and kept moving. The box rolled across the pavement, right toward the curb, and then the camera lost sight of it. Daniel leaned closer to the screen, because now the missing piece of the story suddenly made sense. The box hadn't been taken from the porch by Walter Harris. It had rolled into the street, and sometime later, someone must have picked it up. Daniel closed the laptop slowly. Across the street, Walter Harris's porch light was glowing again. The trumpet rested beside his chair, and Daniel realized something important. The man he had been quietly fighting for a week might actually have been caught in the middle of someone else's crime. A crime Daniel had misunderstood. A trap Daniel himself had set. Daniel stood up, walked to the front door, and opened it. The evening air was cool, the neighborhood quiet. Across the street, Walter Harris looked up from his chair. Daniel hesitated for a moment, because sometimes the hardest thing to do is admit you were wrong. And sometimes the longest distance between two people is simply the width of a quiet suburban street. Daniel took a slow breath, stepped off the porch, and began walking toward the house across the road, because it was time to finally ask the question he should have asked from the beginning. Not with suspicion, not with anger, but with honesty, and neither of them yet knew that this conversation would change the meaning of the trumpet forever. The distance between the two houses wasn't very far, maybe 30 steps. But that evening, as Daniel crossed the quiet street, it felt longer than it ever had before. The air was cool. The sky had turned a deep shade of blue. Just before night fully settled in, Walter Harris was still sitting in his chair when Daniel reached the edge of the driveway. The old man looked up. He didn't seem surprised, almost as if he had expected this moment to arrive sooner or later. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The street was quiet. A car passed slowly at the far end of the block. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, then finally said the words that had been building in his chest all day. "I owe you an apology." Walter didn't react immediately. He simply studied Daniel's face. "What for?" he asked calmly. Daniel glanced down at the driveway, then back up. "For the box." Walter raised an eyebrow. "The one that smelled like something died inside it." Daniel winced slightly. "Yes, that one. For the first time, a small smile appeared on the old man's face. "Well," Walter said, "that explains a few things." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "I thought someone was stealing my packages." Walter nodded slowly. "I figured." Daniel blinked. "You did." Walter leaned back in his chair. "You've been watching this porch the same way I've been watching yours." Daniel hadn't expected that answer. Walter gestured toward the street. "I've lived here a long time." Isan, when someone starts checking their window every 5 minutes, it's not hard to guess something's bothering them. Daniel let out a quiet breath. "I installed a camera yesterday." Walter waited. Daniel continued. "There's a guy, a delivery driver. He comes back after the truck leaves, takes the packages." Walter nodded once. "That makes sense." Daniel frowned slightly. "You're not surprised?" Walter shrugged. "People change." He tapped his fingers lightly on the trumpet beside him. "Used to be this neighborhood didn't worry about things like that." Daniel followed the old man's gaze toward the street. "Yeah, well, I guess things change." There was another pause. Then Walter spoke again. "That box rolled into the street." Daniel looked back at him. Walter continued. "I saw it when I went to check the mail." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "You didn't know it was mine." Walter shook his head. "No name on the outside. So I figured maybe something inside would say who it belonged to." He chuckled softly. "Turns out it just said, 'Get out of the house fast.'" Daniel laughed despite himself. "Yeah, sorry about that." Walter waved a hand. "I've smelled worse." For the first time since this whole strange conflict began, the tension between them eased. Not completely, but enough. Daniel noticed something then. The trumpet resting against Walter's chair. Up close. The brass looked older than he expected. Polished in places, worn in others. "Army band?" Daniel asked. Walter nodded. 40 years ago." Daniel whistled quietly. "That's impressive." Walter shrugged. "Just a job." But there was something in his voice. A hint of pride. Daniel pointed toward the instrument. "You're good." Walter tilted his head slightly. "Not as good as I used to be." He studied Daniel for a moment. "But you're not bad either." Daniel laughed. "That's generous." Walter leaned forward slightly. "You know why your notes crack?" Daniel smiled. "Because I haven't practiced in 10 years." Walter chuckled. "Partly." He lifted the trumpet, placed it to his lips, and played a single note. Clear, warm, strong. The sound floated through the evening air like a slow breath. Walter lowered the instrument again. "Trumpet isn't about the lips," he said. "It's about the breath." Daniel nodded slowly. "I'll remember that." The two men sat quietly for a moment, watching the street, watching the peaceful rhythm of the neighborhood continue. Finally, Daniel stood. "Well, thanks for not holding a grudge." Walter looked at him. "I'm 80 years old." He said, "If I held grudges for every mistake people made, I'd never sleep." Daniel smiled, then turned to walk back toward his house. But before he reached the curb, Walter called out, "Daniel." Daniel turned. Walter lifted the trumpet slightly. "Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock." Daniel nodded. "I'll be ready." Walter smiled faintly. "Good." The next morning, the street woke up to the now familiar sound. A trumpet. But this time, there were 2 of them. Daniel stood on his porch. Walter stood on his. The first note came from the old man. "Strong. Clear." Daniel answered. "Still rough, but improving." The neighborhood listened again. Curtains moved. Front doors opened. Neighbors smiled quietly to themselves. Because what had once sounded like the beginning of a feud now sounded like something else entirely. Two musicians, two houses, one quiet street, and the sound of a trumpet that no longer meant retaliation. Now it meant something much simpler: connection. But the story of that trumpet was not finished yet, because the truth about the stolen packages still needed to be settled. And before the week ended, Daniel and Walter would meet someone else on that porch. Someone who never expected to be recognized. Someone who believed no one in the quiet neighborhood was paying attention. Someone who had no idea that two men who watched the street every day had finally started working together. The next few mornings followed a new rhythm. At exactly 7:00 a.m., the trumpet sounded. Not one, two. The first note almost always came from Walter Harris. It was steady, strong, the kind of sound that carried across the quiet street with confidence. Then Daniel answered. At first, his notes were uneven, sometimes thin, sometimes slightly sharp. But each morning, they improved, and something interesting began to happen on the block. People started expecting it. Mrs. Patterson watered her flowers a little earlier. A man walking his dog slowed near the corner. One morning, a child on a bicycle stopped completely and listened. The neighborhood had grown used to silence for years. Now the trumpet had become part of its mornings, a symbol of something unusual, something quietly beautiful. But Daniel never forgot why all of this had started. The stolen packages. The video. The man who returned after the delivery trucks left. Daniel had saved every recording. Every day he checked the camera again. And sure enough, 2 days later, the same man returned. The same jacket. The same cautious steps. He moved quickly toward the porch. But this time, the box wasn't there. The man looked confused. He glanced toward the street, toward the driveway, then walked away. Daniel watched the video twice, then 3 times. The man clearly expected something, which meant one thing. He had been doing this regularly. Daniel closed the laptop slowly, then walked outside. Across the street, Walter Harris was already sitting on his porch. The trumpet rested beside him. Walter noticed Daniel immediately. "You catch him yet?" the old man asked. Daniel nodded. On camera, Walter raised an eyebrow. "Well then." Daniel sat down on the edge of the porch steps. "He comes back after deliveries," Daniel said. "Takes the boxes." Walter nodded slowly. "That explains the timing." Daniel looked across the street. "Tomorrow I'm leaving another package." Walter glanced at him. "A real one?" Daniel smiled faintly. "No." Walter leaned back in his chair. "A trap," Daniel shrugged. "Something like that." Walter studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Good." The next afternoon, Daniel placed another box on the porch. From the outside, it looked completely ordinary. Shipping label, tape, everything. But this time, Daniel wasn't relying on smell or tricks. Inside the box was something simple. A GPS tracker. Small, silent, hidden between packing paper. Daniel stepped back and checked the camera angle. Perfect. Now all they had to do was wait. The following morning, the trumpet sounded again. 2 voices, answering each other across the street. A melody slowly forming between them. Walter started with a familiar exercise. Daniel followed. A long note drifted across the quiet houses. And for a moment, the story seemed almost peaceful again. But Daniel knew something was coming. Later that afternoon, the delivery truck arrived. The driver dropped the package on the porch. Daniel watched from the camera feed. He waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Then movement. The same man returned. He stepped onto the porch quickly, picked up the box, and disappeared down the sidewalk. Daniel didn't move. He opened the tracking app. The small blinking dot began moving across the map. Slowly. Then, faster. Daniel grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. Across the street, Walter Harris was already standing. "You see him?" the old man asked. Daniel held up his phone. He took the bait. Walter smiled slightly. "Well then," he said, "let's go for a walk." The two men moved down the street together, following the blinking dot on the phone screen. The thief hadn't gone far, just a few blocks away. Near a row of parked cars, Daniel slowed his steps. The map showed the signal directly ahead, and there he was. The same man from the video, standing beside an old sedan, opening the stolen package. Walter and Daniel stopped several feet away. The man looked up. His expression froze. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Walter stepped forward calmly. "You dropped something last week," he said. The man frowned. What? Walter nodded toward Daniel. "His package." The man's eyes darted between them, then toward the box in his hands, then toward the street behind him. But there was nowhere to go. Daniel held up his phone. "I've got video," he said quietly. The man's shoulders sagged. For a moment he looked like he might run, but instead he lowered his head. "Look," he muttered. "I was just trying to make some money." Walter's voice stayed calm. "Stealing from people isn't the way to do that." The man didn't answer. He simply placed the package back in Daniel's hands. Daniel looked at it, then at the man. "You should find another job," Daniel said. The man nodded slowly, then climbed into his car and drove away. The street returned to silence. Daniel stood there, holding the box. Walter looked at him. "Well," the old man said, "that settles that." Daniel let out a long breath. Yeah. For the first time in weeks, the problem was finally solved. But something else had changed too. Daniel glanced at Walter. The old man stood quietly beside him, trumpet case in one hand, watching the afternoon sun stretch across the street. Daniel smiled. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. Walter nodded. 7 o'clock. And the next morning, just as the sun rose over the quiet suburb, two trumpets answered each other again. But now the sound meant something different. Not suspicion, not frustration, not retaliation. Now it meant friendship, a simple sound floating through the morning air, reminding everyone on that street that sometimes the loudest conflicts begin with misunderstandings, and the strongest connections begin with a single note.